Morning everybody. So this video about the National Uprising, the election campaign in Germany of February to March 1933 is the first of a series of videos which looks at the creation of a totalitarian state in Germany by Adolf Hitler in the beginning of his chancellorship. Just so you can sort of see the context of what we're doing here. So as you can see, a whole series of lessons there. You can see the number of lessons on the left hand side, the majority of which will be for depth study 3. We've done 3 lessons so far, which is sort of set in the context, the background to the rise to power of Adolf Hitler. We've reached Hitler becoming the Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. And so we've now got a series of lessons on how he turned his chancellorship into a dictatorship. As you can see, and I've circled it in red, there'll be about 5 lessons on this particular topic, and he didn't actually really achieve the dictatorship until August 1934, more than a year and a half after he became Chancellor. We'll then do a series of lessons, 3 lessons, which I'm just highlighting there, on the leadership style of Nazi Germany. And then we'll move into a series of lessons after that, which will pretty much take us to the summer holidays, which are mainly information about society and the economy. So it's more for section C, the breadth study questions, although there is 2 lessons in the middle there where we'll look at racial policy, which again will feed into the depth study section B question. Okay, so let's move on. So as always, at the outset of a new depth study, it's really important to kind of like spend a little bit of time looking through the questions that you could be asked. You can pause the video at this point, and you've obviously got the slideshow as well, which hopefully you've downloaded from the Padlet page. But have a quick look through those questions there. Now what I've done here is I've grouped them for you, so you can get a sense of the type of questions that could be asked, because quite a few of the questions repeat themselves. Okay, so as you can see, section B questions, the depth study questions, there's a number of them, questions 1, 5, 6 and 9, so you can look there, 1, 5, 6 and 9, tend to be about the nature of this Nazi revolution that we're looking at in the next 5 lessons or so. Okay, in other words, how he turned his chancellorship into a dictatorship. And they often ask the question, was it a legal revolution, or in fact was it a revolution, or was it more an evolution? Okay, so be thinking about that as we sort of like work our way through the next series of lessons. Then you can get there's a lot of questions there, questions 2, 7, 8, 10 and 15 are about the popularity of the Nazis. Okay, and in particular it's this issue, why did people follow Hitler? Was it because they were afraid of him, or was it because he was genuinely popular, they genuinely supported him? In other words, it was based on consent. And as you can see, that's questions 11, 12 and 13. And almost like to prove the point that examiners are quite devious, that they don't like to be predictable, suddenly in 2019, last year, they threw out an oddball question, one that was just on racial policy about the Nuremberg laws of 1935. So that's that one there. Okay, then the ones in red, as you can see, quite often, or in the 2018 paper and in the 2017 paper, so 2 out of the 3 years this paper has been examined, section A has been a Nazi Germany document. Okay, again, you can sort of like get a sense of that. So there was one there about the Nazi treatment of the Jews, and then there was another one about the Night of the Long Knives. Okay, those 2 there, and also there's quite a lot for you to look at in the revision guide, the Alan Farmer revision guide. There is one about the Enabling Act, SPD attitudes to Hitler. Have a look at that. And then there is also one about the Nazi approach to opposition. That's the one there, the Hafner source we've already looked at. We use that as an example in our lesson. And then here, number 14, there's one about German attitudes to women's rights and Hitler's views about the people's community. And again, that one is also in the revision guide. So you've got lots of material for you to work through there in terms of practicing questions and so on and so forth. So there they are. The next few slides, I won't repeat them to you, but it tells you exactly where you can find the particular questions. Okay. How powerful was Hitler in Nazism? Was he a master or weak dictator? How efficient? And again, you can sort of see there's quite a lot in the revision guides. Okay, and also the second specimen paper, particular one. The popularity of the Nazis, again, in the Alan Farmer revision guide. There's quite a lot there. Nazi racial policy, that was actually the 2019 paper. So have a look at the Chief Examiner report, which you can download from the website, where there'll be a scanned answer, but obviously look at the mark scheme and in particular the indicative content of the mark scheme, where you'll be given an indication of the type of material that the examiners were looking for. Okay, so moving on, this particular topic, what we're looking at today, the National Uprising, William Carr, pages 308 to 310. Stephen J. Lee, chapter 2 of his book Hitler and Nazi Germany. So we're now moving on to the third volume is Stephen J. Lee's books. Remember, we've already looked at Imperial Germany and then Weimar Germany. Now Hitler and Nazi Germany, his third book. Chapter 2 is about the achievement and consolidation of power in the years 1933 to 34. There's a good background narrative that takes you through the events of that. And then his second essay, Was There a Legal Revolution? Between 1933 and 1934. And have a look at the sources at the back of that chapter and make notes in any sources which you could incorporate into essays on that depth study. So there's some good source material for you to look at there as well. Okay. And also my YouTube channel, if you go to the playlist, there's more than 20 videos. I've done a lot of videos about Hitler's consolidation of power. You obviously can't click on the link on this YouTube video, but if you go to the PowerPoint, you can click on the direct link there that takes you directly to the playlist. But especially useful is I've done a walk and talk video for you in which I walk and talk you through my own notes to that S.J. Lee essay, Was There a Legal Revolution? Okay, so play that one at some point in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we're going through this topic about the consolidation of power. And I'll upload my notes to the Stephen J. Lee as well as the original Stephen J. Lee essay to the Padlet page for this lesson. Okay, so let's get into the content, the context. Now, as I say, this is one of a series of 6 lessons on how Hitler turned his chancellorship into a dictatorship, what we call the creating a totalitarian state. So the 6 lessons, you can see them there, broadly broken into 3 topics, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so quick overview here. Have a look at what we're saying here. So although Hitler did not have a clear plan to turn his chancellorship into a dictatorship, he didn't have a clear plan. We can now see that the process took more than 1.5 years. It wasn't until August 1934, when President Hindenburg died in his sleep, he was a very old man, that we can say that Hitler, in a sense, had really become a dictator. For the first 1.5 years in power, he wasn't really a dictator. Okay, and once he had become dictator, we start to call him the Führer. But so that 1.5 year period, for the purpose of teaching this topic, we're going to break it down into 3 phases. Okay, so those are the 3 phases there. 1, which we'll do today, and then three lessons will be phase 2, and then phase 3. Okay, so I've just given you a quick sort of overview of those here. Just have a look at. Okay, so you're not actually mind mapping yet. We haven't started the mind mapping. This is just background. So phase one, which is what we're looking at today, is the National Uprising election campaign, which was from February to the 5th of March 1933. Key features are the atmosphere of violence during the election campaign, the Reichstag fire decree, and then the election outcome on the 5th of March 1933, 6 weeks after Hitler became Chancellor. So that's what we're going to do. And we'll then do 3 lessons, because it's quite a meaty topic, on what is called the period of Gleichschaltung, or coordination, which lasted from March through to July 1933. And that basically, it's a big word, but it simply means most aspects of German life were brought under Nazi control. The process really began famously with the Enabling Act being passed. We'll look at that. And in particular, we'll focus in on 3 main ways in which Hitler used his powers given to him by the Enabling Act to bring the separate states under his control, to get rid of the powers of the trade unions, and to create a one-party dictatorship. Okay, so that's going to be 3 lessons on that. And then we'll do 2 lessons on what is called halting the Second Revolution. Now, as you can see there, that actually lasted for more than a year, this particular phase. And this was all about overcoming the final obstacle. The one thing that stood in Hitler's way was the fact there was the Weimar president, the president of the Weimar Republic, the old man, President Hindenburg, who was commander-in-chief of the army. And that was a difficult problem for Hitler to resolve, because until Hindenburg was out of the way, then Hitler would never really control the army. So he had to find a way through that. And he very famously dealt with it with the so-called Night of the Long Knives, which happened on the 30th of June 1934. 6 weeks later, Hindenburg died of old age in his bed, peacefully in bed. But because of what happened on the Night of the Long Knives, the army basically were captured, and they swore an oath of loyalty to Hitler. So that completed the final phase of the so-called Nazi revolution, which turned Hitler into a dictator. So that's an overview of, including this lesson, 6 hours worth of learning there, just to give you that big picture. Okay, so let's get on with what we're going to do today, which is the National Uprising election campaign. So hopefully you've printed off that mind map. If you haven't, pause the video, go to the Padlet page, download the mind map, print it off, stick it onto an A3 sheet in the middle, so you've got plenty of space around the edge to do your mind mapping. Or if you haven't got an A3 sheet, stick 2 sheets of A4 together and stick the mind map into the middle of it. Okay, so obviously pause the video while you do that, and we'll push on in exactly the same way as we normally do. So I'll give you an overview of each of the 5 strands, and then you can pause the video while you sort of like make the notes for each of the key points. Okay, so let's get into the first. Before that, there's our big picture. Okay, that's what we're moving towards. By the time we finish this video, you'll have reached, hopefully, we'll have gone through all of that information, okay, plus more. Okay, so it's quite a lot to get through. So we'll begin with the 30th of January obstacles. Here, and as you can see, you're mapping out these 3 strands. So in a nutshell, what are the key points? Let's just go through this. On the 30th of January 1933, then, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Okay, remember, the Chancellor of Germany is just the word for Prime Minister. Okay, head of government. Okay, now in reality, Hitler's power was limited by the Weimar Constitution, as had all the previous chancellors. Their power had been limited. Remember, the chancellor before Hitler was Schleicher, and before him was von Papen, and before him was Brüning, and so on and so forth, going all the way back to 1919. Hitler was really no different. Okay, his power was limited. Now, you need to be able to articulate how his power was restricted. Okay, it's almost like he had chains around his ankles and arms. Okay, he couldn't. His ability to do what he wanted to do was restricted by the Constitution. So firstly, remember, he was a coalition chancellor. Okay, so within his 12-man cabinet, most of the men in his cabinet were actually not Nazis. 9 out of the 12 men in his cabinet were not members of the Nazi Party. In fact, they were right-wing, but they were mainly conservative politicians, mainly members of the German People's Party, the German Nationalist Party, led by Alfred Hugenberg. Okay, only 3 out of the 12 men in Hitler's cabinet, including Hitler himself, were members of the Nazi Party. Okay. Secondly, you look at the actual Reichstag, the large elected representative assembly through which laws have got to be approved. Only 1/3 of the seats in the Reichstag, it was 196, okay, seats were controlled by the Nazi Party. The remaining seats, 2/3 of the seats, were controlled by other political parties. Now, 196 was 33%, yeah, 1/3. Okay, now to get laws passed, Hitler needed to control 50% or more, so he's not even close to being able to pass laws by himself. In other words, to pass laws, he's going to have to get other parties to vote on his side. Thirdly, yes, there was a term in the in the Weimar Constitution, written by Hugo Preuss back in 1919. It was Article 48, which did allow the Chancellor to pass laws without the Reichstag by going straight to the President. And Article 48 had been used a lot since 1930, particularly by Brüning, Chancellor Brüning. So Hitler could pass laws by going to the President, but the problem is President Hindenburg personally disliked Hitler. And that was an obstacle. Hitler had made no secret of the fact that he wanted, in the end, to dismantle the Weimar Republic and create an authoritarian dictatorship. But Hindenburg was not prepared to tolerate that. Hindenburg said, no, we have a duty to try to make the Republic work. And he personally didn't like Hitler. He saw him as a jumped-up little... He wasn't even a German. Hitler was an Austrian. From a lower middle class background, and Hindenburg looked down on him and remember, Hindenburg had been persuaded by von Papen to make Hitler Chancellor. Okay, Hindenburg had never really wanted to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. He'd been persuaded by the previous Chancellor von Papen as part of that revenge thing. Remember, we talked about that in the last video. Another problem is, in the previous election, just 2 months earlier, in November 1932, Nazi support had fallen from 37% to the 33%. They'd actually, previously in July 1932, had 230 seats, but that had dropped to 196. That was 2 million voters. Okay, so the reality is, basically, 2 out of every 3 German people had voted for other parties in the elections of November 1932. Most German people had actually voted for either the KPD, the communists, or the SPD. Okay, so actually those 2 parties between them gathered 37% of the vote. Okay, now the Nazis only got 33% of the vote. Okay, so although the Nazis were the largest party, there was a much stronger vote on the left wing of politics than there was for the Nazi Party. Okay, so there was a lot, basically, that was standing in Hitler's way. So that's it in a nutshell. Okay, the obstacles, the detail. Just take a minute to remind yourself of the way the Weimar Constitution worked. It's really, really important. You may want to pause this video and go back and have a look at your notes. We did a lesson way back early in year 12 about the Weimar Constitution, how laws were passed. Okay, that was a diagram we used at the time. You may just want to remind yourself of some of the key points. I'm not going to teach you them again, though. That's for you to go back and look at that. And here's the details taken from the textbook. Okay, so the perception at the time was that Hitler was just the latest. There'd been 15 chancellors since November 1918. Okay, never lasted very long. Hitler was seen to be just the most recent. To say he was a coalition chancellor. We said they'd lost 2 million votes. Previously, 37% dropped to 33%. We said that there were only 3 Nazis in Hitler's first cabinet. Make sure you know who they are. Hitler as the Chancellor, Hermann Goering as Minister without Portfolio, and Wilhelm Frick as Reich Minister of the Interior. But the other 9 men in the cabinet, because there were 12 positions altogether, were mainly conservatives, mainly from the DNVP, led by Alfred Hugenberg. That's not the same as Hindenburg, don't get them confused, with some from the Centre Party. Okay, so that party there, the DNVP and the ZP, between them, they actually had 9 of the 12 seats. Okay, which is the point that's made there. And remember, when you talk about a cabinet, each of the members of a cabinet is a minister. Okay, a Minister of Foreign Affairs, a Minister of Economics, a Minister of Agriculture, and so on. Now, the most important cabinet positions, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defence, and the Minister of Economics, were held by conservatives, not by Nazis. Okay, so it's not just the fact that the Nazis were outnumbered in the cabinet, okay, but the key positions in the cabinet, with the exception of the position of Chancellor, which Hitler held, the key positions in the cabinet were held by non-Nazis. Okay, and then the head of state, the president, as we said, Hindenburg, disliked Hitler and had the power to sack him at any point. Okay, and this man, von Papen, remember, had helped Hitler into power by persuading Hindenburg to give him the job. And von Papen arrogantly believed that his type of men could pull Hitler's strings and use him like a puppet. But the other thing, of course, is 2 out of every 3 Germans, ordinary Germans on the streets, were not really sold on Hitler. And in the most recent elections of November 1932, they had 2 out of the 3 Germans had actually voted for other parties. Okay, so there's our first strand. Now you may want to pause, consolidate, read through that again, do your mind mapping, just make sure you're secure. We'll now move on to the National Uprising then. What was this? Okay, so we've looked at the date Hitler became Chancellor. Now we're going to talk about the National Uprising. Okay, so in a nutshell, what are we saying? Hitler, in spite of all those obstacles, was confident that he could sort them out. And that is part of the deal that had been made in January 1933 that had resulted in Hitler being appointed as Chancellor. And that was a deal that Hitler made with von Papen, okay, included Hitler insisting, he said, I will accept the offer of being Chancellor on the condition that we dissolve the Reichstag and call another general election. Okay, because remember, the Nazis have got 196 seats from the most recent elections, and that's not enough, only 33% of the seats. So clearly what Hitler hopes is in another general election that the Nazi vote will go up, and hopefully it will go up to 50% or higher. Okay, because that's the number of votes that is needed. That's the proportion of seats you need in the Reichstag to be able to pass laws by yourself. Okay, now that's a huge turnaround that's needed. Okay, because it's not just about recovering the lost 2 million votes from November, but it's also about getting enough extra votes to hit that 50% majority. But Hitler was confident that he could do that. Okay, so a date was set for new elections 6 weeks ahead on the 5th of March 1933. Why was Hitler so confident? Several reasons. Firstly, the Nazis were good at propaganda. Okay, it was their real strength. Hitler as a public speaker, the mass rallies, the mass persuasion. Remember, the Nazi vote in basically less than 5 years has gone up from 3% to 33%. The Nazis are good at selling their ideas to the masses. Okay, so what's changed? How can Hitler suddenly turn this around and get to 50%? Well, what has changed is in all the previous general elections, and there's been quite a lot of them. There was, there was one in May 1928, and then September 1930, and then in July 32, and then again in November 32, and now again in March 33. This is the 5th general election in 5 years. But in all those previous ones, the Nazis had campaigned as an opposition party. Now, with this new election campaign set for March 1933, the Nazis are campaigning as the party in power. They're in office. And as Chancellor, that gives Hitler and his propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, and Hitler created a special ministry of propaganda now called the Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda, and Goebbels now became the Minister for Propaganda within Hitler's government. Now that Hitler's in power, he has got automatic access to state-run media, okay, and especially the radio. Remember, there was no real TV in those days. Okay, TV was just in the very, very early stages of its development, but the main form of mass communication was through the radio, and the radio was state-owned. Okay, a little bit like the BBC for television and radio in the UK today. Okay, has got strong links to the state. Okay, in terms of public ownership. Through TV license and so on and so forth. Well, it was not completely dissimilar to that in Germany at that particular time. The radio was state-owned, and so it meant that Hitler, as the head of government, had greater access to putting his views on the radio than he previously would have had as just a leader of an opposition party. So that was sort of like a key string to his bow. So the day after Hitler became Chancellor, he gave a key speech, the 31st of January 1933, and this was when he announced to the German people there will be a new election on the 5th of March, and he said the Nazi Party will campaign in this election on the ticket, the National Uprising. Okay, and so basically he was saying that the Nazi Party speak for the German people, okay, that there is an uprising, the view of the German people is being expressed through the Nazi Party. Now, of course, that was rubbish because the Nazi Party only spoke for one out of every three Germans. But nevertheless, Hitler wanted to create the impression that the Nazi Party spoke for all Germans. And a key message of the way in which the Nazis campaigned for the next 6 weeks was that Germany was under grave threat from the communists. Okay, and as you know, on the extreme left, the communists had been increasing their vote, particularly with the onset of the Great Depression, and so Hitler, in this election campaign, presented the Nazis as the only party who could effectively deal with the communist threat. And we talked about that in the previous lesson, about how the Nazis portrayed themselves as a party not of talk, but a party of action, backed up by the stormtroopers, the SA, the brown shirts, etc., etc. Okay, and there were 5 key features of this election campaign. Okay, which we'll pick out in a little bit more detail in the notes that sit underneath. Okay, so there's in a nutshell. Now, again, you may want to pause as I go through the next bit, which looks at the sort of detail that sits underneath that. So again, just don't need to talk about every single point. So what have we covered so far? So that was, remember, Hitler's deal, new election set for the 5th of March. So as Chancellor, he's actually campaigning as the party in power, puts him in a stronger position. The Nazis were already good at propaganda. Okay, one of the key reasons for their rise is they were a party of action, not words. Remember, we talked about their vague promises of national unity, the mass rallies. They had a real understanding of mass psychology. And how to sort of appeal to the votes of ordinary people. And the mastermind for the way Nazis managed their propaganda was Joseph Goebbels, okay? And with a team of what were called Gauleiters, and that literally they were like regional propaganda experts scattered across Germany who were experts at selling the Nazi message to the voters. Okay, and it was Goebbels and his Gauleiters who masterminded Hitler's incredible rise to power, especially during the worst years of the Great Depression, 1929 to 32. So make sure you made a note about the Gauleiters, because we will pick that up in future lessons. They are important people within the Nazi Party structure that you will need to be able to talk about. Okay, do you remember I said in a nutshell how Hitler launched his election campaign on the 31st of January when he announced the phrase the National Uprising, and it was a radio speech. Okay, so again, the key points here. Let's have a quick look. So 6-week election campaign, access to the state media, especially the radio we mentioned. There's that famous speech. Make sure you make a note of its name on the radio. There's the voice of the people. That's why it was called the National Uprising campaign. And he declared that the new Germany, as a result of this election, would become the Third Reich. Okay, we've had the Second Reich that ended in 1918 with the abdication of the Kaiser, replaced by the Weimar Republic, and he announced that the Weimar Republic will come to an end as a result of this election, and the new Germany will be the Third Reich, which Hitler announced would last for 1,000 years. Now, of course, we know it only lasted for 12. It ended in 1945 with Germany's destruction at the end of World War II. Now, it was an extraordinary election campaign, unlike any other election campaign. An astonishing wave of propaganda. Goebbels was in his element, but also a huge amount of political violence. And the central theme of the election campaign that the Nazis pitched, they wanted to build up a sort of hysterical sense of hysteria that there was an impending risk of a communist revolution, that the communists were plotting to take power as they had done in Russia in 1917, and that only the Nazis could stop this from happening. Okay, so it was trying to whip up, in particular, the middle classes who would lose out the most if the communists were to take power, whipping up the middle class fear so that the middle classes will vote for the Nazis on the 5th of March 1933. Okay, quick pause. Now again, this is for you. I'm not going to take you through that. I put onto this a quick knowledge retrieval. Let's just see how many of the points that we've just covered so far you can remember. So pause the video, have a go at that. 13 questions. See if you can jot down all the answers. And the next slide will give you the answers. Okay. In fact, all of the points there. The one I don't think I mentioned was the name of the non-Nazi Minister of Foreign Affairs in Hitler's cabinet was called von Neurath. I think all of the other points I covered in my commentary. So just testing how well you're absorbing the facts. Remember, you've got to absorb the details as well as the key points. Okay. So remember we said in the nutshell there were 5 key features of the National Uprising election campaign. Well, what were these key features? Okay, because they all were like seeds that were planted during the election campaign, and then they all grew and became common features afterwards for the next 2 years and beyond. Okay, so that's why it's important to sort of like pick up these key features. I mean, you could be asked a question on each of these features. Okay, so what were Okay, well, one key feature was political violence, especially violence by the stormtroopers, the Nazi private army, the stormtroopers. So again, be mindful of that and look out for that theme in later lessons, because that will be an important strand of this. Now, in the National Uprising campaign, the Nazi stormtroopers were used in particular to beat up communists on the street, to smash up communist printing presses so they couldn't actually print off their leaflets and so on. Incredible use of propaganda, particularly this man here, Joseph Goebbels, who masterminded the way in which the Nazis sold their messages in a positive way, okay, through films, through newspaper reports, but in particular flags and music, etc., etc. And that will become important. We'll see that in the next lesson when we do about the passing of the Enabling Act. One of the masterminds of Goebbels was the so-called Day of Potsdam, which was a propaganda triumph, 21st of March 1933. So that's that. The third strand is what we call pretensive legality, pseudo-legality. Okay, ever since 1923, when Hitler was sent to jail, remember the beer hall putsch of 1923? Hitler tried to take power illegally by using violence to march on Berlin and do what Mussolini had done in Italy in 1922. Well, it didn't work. Hitler ended up being stopped by the Conservatives, by the army, and told he was being a bad boy and put into jail for 9 months and got let out. And for 10 years, Hitler's learned his lesson that if he's going to overthrow the Weimar Republic, he does have the support of the Conservatives, but they will only support him as long as he basically works within the law to dismantle the constitution. So he's got to bring about a dictatorship through a legal revolution rather than through a violent, illegal revolution. Okay, so at every stage, even though there was violence, okay, and we see that in the National Uprising election campaign, there was a great deal of violence, communists being beaten up in the streets, etc. Hitler was at great pains always to emphasise that he was following the letter of the law, and that will continue certainly for the next 2 years. Okay, so again, that's a common theme that you need to be aware of. The fourth theme is this sort of idea that Hitler's political backers, people like von Papen we've spoken about, they were the people who put Hitler into the chancellorship. They did that because they believed that Hitler was basically a puppet, somebody whose strings they could pull. He had what they didn't have. He had mass support, lots of popularity on the streets, but in the end they thought Hitler was basically not particularly bright and therefore could be controlled by them. And there's that sort of a very famous cartoon here. Here are the Conservatives. There's von Papen, the Chancellor, before Hitler, well, the two chancellors before Hitler, but the person who persuaded Hindenburg to make Hitler Chancellor. And there's Hugenberg, the leader of the German Nationalist Party, who, like von Papen, was very sort of conservative, rich, upper class, the old school, sort of Prussian Junker type conservatives. And there's Hitler thinking he's driving the motor car. In other words, Hitler thinking he's in control of Germany. But in actual fact, the real power lies with the people in the back seat who are really driving the car. Okay, and that's a bit of a joke, making a joke about the fact that Hitler is their puppet, or at least they think that they are pulling Hitler's strings. But are they really is the key thing, because that's off that strand. They are miscalculating. They are underestimating how cunning Hitler is. Okay, his immense political cunning. It's not the fact they are driving the motor car and that Hitler isn't. Hitler is pretending to let them drive the motor car. Okay, Hitler will go along with this and pretend to be their puppet, but in actual fact, he is ready to cut the strings and break loose from the puppeteers. Okay, and that's the sort of key point there, is that we'll see how Hitler very cleverly used, the Nazis only had 3 positions in the cabinet, but Hitler very cleverly used those 3 positions to strengthen his power. Okay, and in particular, 2 of those cabinet positions, Goering was Minister of the Interior in Prussia, okay, and Frick was Minister of the Interior of the whole of Germany. And those 2 positions between them, in particular Goering, because remember there were separate state governments, Hermann Goering, a Nazi, being Minister of the Interior of Prussia meant that he controlled the policing of 60% of Germany, because the police forces of Germany were controlled by the separate states. Policing, law and order, was the responsibility of the state governments. So the fact that Goering, who was in the national government, one of the 3 positions in the national government, Goering also was Minister President of Prussia, Minister of the Interior of Prussia, which gave him enormous control over the policing of Germany. We'll come on to that in a few minutes. Okay, so again, you can pause, take time to consolidate, but we will now move on to the third strand, which is this issue of political violence. Okay, so what are the key points? So the election campaign, 6 weeks, different political parties, including the Nazis, are out there campaigning for votes, was unlike any previous general election because it had an astonishing level of political violence. And that violence was mainly the Nazis beating up communists, street battles, physical destruction of communist publication houses. So it was very difficult for the communists to campaign. Now, the main tool for that political violence were the Nazis' private army, the SA, the brown shirts, who were led by a man called Ernst Röhm. And by 1933, the SA were a big force, 250,000 men, nearly 250,000 men, and getting larger by each week, each month. Now, the SA had been around for a long time. They had originally formed back in the early 1920s. And for 10 long years, ever since the failed Munich Putsch of 1923, the SA had been instructed by Hitler to behave themselves. So they'd had to avoid using violence because Hitler's path to power was legal, okay? Now that Hitler is in power, Hitler's message to them was, your time has come. I'll let you off the leash. They're a little bit like a mad dog that's been put on the lead for 10 years. And so Hitler's going to let them off the leash during this election campaign. And he's going to simply say to them, go for the communists, okay? Target your hatred against the communists. Because if you do that, that'll be a vote winner for the middle classes. We want to get the middle classes to vote for us because they'll see that we can effectively deal with the threat of communism, okay? But the problem is that he's got to maintain that pretense of legality. So this is, again, an example of Hitler's political cunning. Because remember, the Nazi Hermann Goering, who was one of Hitler's 3 cabinet members, was also the Minister of the Interior for the Prussian state government. Now, there were 18 different states, and Prussia was the largest, and the policing of Germany was controlled by the state government, so there were basically 18 different police forces. But because Prussia made up 60% of Germany, whoever controls the police in Prussia was very, very powerful, and it happened to be a Nazi. Okay, and one of the things that Hermann Goering did very quickly in February 1933 is he auxiliarised 50,000 stormtroopers to the Prussian police. Now, all that basically meant is he gave them armbands and said, you 50,000, and basically, let's face it, they were thugs. These are thugs. These are not policemen. These are Nazi henchmen, strong-armed thugs. The stormtroopers were not nice guys. Most of them had been to prison in the 1920s. They were criminals. They were not family men. They were sort of thugs. And basically, Goering issued them an armband that said, if you wear this armband, you basically carry the same authority as a policeman. Okay? So what that basically meant is that the Nazi violence during the election campaign was, strictly speaking, legal. It was not against the law, or at least it was presented in that way. Okay, so there's in our nutshell. Now the detail, we talked about Hermann Goering. There is a picture. Okay, Minister of the Interior for Prussia. Okay, Goering, don't confuse him with Goebbels. I know the names sound similar, but they're different. Okay, same way you mustn't confuse Hugenberg with Hindenburg. Okay, that is important. The precision is really important. So we've talked about the violence targeted against communists, middle class hysteria. It's whipping up that sort of middle class fear of communism so that the middle classes will vote for the Nazis. The Nazis presenting themselves as we're the only force strong enough that can stop a communist revolution. We're going to be the national saviours to prevent Germany plunging into communism. Because obviously if Germany becomes communist, then the middle classes will lose their status and their wealth, because communism is property is theft and redistribution of wealth amongst the ordinary people. So there's the point. Auxiliarising 50,000 of his private army, paramilitary fighters. So the deputised mainly from the SA, the brown shirts led by Rome. Within the SA, and we'll develop this further, there was a smaller group called the black shirts, the SS, and they were led by Heinrich Himmler. So Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, was Himmler's boss. And the black shirts were actually Hitler's personal bodyguard. Okay, much smaller group, only a few thousand, whereas there were about 250,000, and the SA were getting stronger and stronger. Okay, by the end of 1933, we're talking about, pushing towards 2 million. Now that Hitler's in power, many people were just joining the SA. And there were also other right-wing paramilitary groups, as they were called, private armies, and another one was called the Stahlhelm, the Steel Helmets. They eventually were incorporated into the Nazi stormtrooper movement, but they likewise played a part in supporting the Nazis during the National Uprising election campaign. Again, the detail is important because this is A-level, so make sure you get any words in bold really need to be part of your notes, and you need to make sure you memorise those points. So officially the goal of the auxiliarised police, these 50,000 thugs given an armband, was to assist the regular police to keep law and order, but in actual fact they were used to attack the communists and also the SPD, who were campaigning for votes, anybody on the political left. So it made it very difficult for left-wing groups to campaign in the general election. And all along, this clear illegal action, because it was violence, was dressed up as being legal. Okay, and that's a key part of a strand that you need to be able to talk about, that we'll be picking up in the next 5 lessons when we follow this path towards Hitler's dictatorship. Okay, so there's the picture. We're building it up. We've covered 3 of the 5 strands now. Let's get into the 4th strand with the Reichstag fire. Now again, you'll know this from GCSE, but again we're looking at this in more detail, more depth, so make sure you're really comfortable and clear about the concept. So at the height of the election campaign, just 1 week before the 5th of March, on the 27th of February 1933, the Nazis benefited from an astonishing piece of good luck. I mean, it was so lucky what happened that for many, many years there was a myth that the Nazis may have actually done this themselves, but actually they didn't. What basically happened was the Reichstag building was burnt down by a crazed communist called van der Lubbe, a Dutch communist, who all the evidence says he was actually acting by himself. He wasn't, although he was a communist, he wasn't acting under the orders of the German Communist Party. He basically just burnt down the Reichstag building, and the Nazis caught him. And in sort of hysteria, all the evidence is the Nazis, was as stunned as anyone else by what had happened. But very quickly, Hitler and the Nazis realised that this actually was good news, because this lone act played into Hitler's hands, because, of course, for 5 weeks, the Nazis had been campaigning in these elections with the message that the communists were a grave threat to German life, that they were plotting a revolution. So suddenly they find this lone communist with a can of petrol in his hand wandering around the corridors of the Reichstag. He's burned the building down. So Hitler decided to turn it into an opportunity. And so immediately that very evening, Hitler claimed, this is it, this is the evidence. The burning of the Reichstag by a communist is part of a bigger plot whereby the burning of the Reichstag is like a beacon, it's like a signal to communists throughout the whole of Germany to seize power and to set up a communist state. Okay, so there is a big plot. It's the equivalent of what Lenin had done in Russia in October 1917. The moment has come where the communists are about to basically overthrow the great German government led by Adolf Hitler. So Hitler wasted no time as head of government. He went rushing to see President Hindenburg and said, look, we haven't got time to pass a law through the Reichstag, because there's no Reichstag because it's burnt down, but even if it hadn't been burnt down, we haven't got time to debate this and to discuss this. This is an emergency. I need you. Remember, Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, written by Hugo Preuss back in 1919, said that in a time of emergency, the Chancellor could get a law passed off quickly and immediately by presidential signature. And any law that was passed that way was called a decree, a presidential decree. It would carry the weight of law. So Hitler went running to the president and persuaded President Hindenburg in the panic of that night to pass what was called later the Reichstag Fire Decree, although the true name, the proper name, was the Decree for the Protection of People and State. And what this decree did is it gave Hitler two crucial powers. Now, firstly, it allowed the police to arrest and imprison people indefinitely without trial. Now, the intention was that the police would be given these powers to arrest communists, but it didn't say communists. It simply said the police can arrest anybody who they deem to be a threat to the life of the German nation. And that was pretty drastic because it was indefinite. But the second article was even more significant. Now, remember, go back to a point I made earlier. Until this moment in time, Hitler actually, even though he's head of government and Chancellor of the whole of Germany, actually had very little control over the policing of Germany. Why? Because remember, Weimar Germany was a federal system. So there was the national government that Hitler's the head of, but there were also 18 separate state governments, okay, each with its own parliament called the Landtag and its own government and head of government. Okay, so 18 separate small governments, and most of those small governments, with the exception of Prussia, which is the largest state, most of those small governments were not controlled by the Nazis. But the problem is, policing, law and order, was the responsibility of the state governments, not the national government, which Hitler was in control over. So that was a worry for Hitler. So when he went running to the president on the evening of the Reichstag fire, the 27th of February 1933, when he persuaded Hindenburg to pass this emergency decree for the protection of people and state, the second clause in that decree allowed Hitler to centralise policing powers in the hands of the national government in Berlin, the government that Hitler is head of. So it took the power of policing away from the separate state governments and centralised them in the hands of the government in Berlin. So very, very far-reaching consequences. And the other point is that when Hindenburg signed that decree, he signed it under the illusion that it was only meant to be a temporary decree. But the problem is, it wasn't actually written into the terms of the decree that it would only last for a few weeks. And that really benefited Hitler because there was no end date. So these powers that Hitler picked up, first of all, the power to arrest and imprison people without trial, and secondly, the power to take over policing, actually could continue for as long as the Chancellor felt it was necessary. And the decision about an end date lay with the Chancellor, not the President. And of course, Hitler was the Chancellor, so therefore Hitler chose to extend those powers for as long as he was leader of Germany. And in actual fact, therefore, the Reichstag Fire Decree provided the basis for Hitler's dictatorship for the next 12 years. And all of these special prisons, for example, that were built up, called the concentration camps, were built up on the basis of the Reichstag Fire Decree. In fact, the very first concentration camp was set up the day after the Reichstag Fire Decree. The Reichstag Fire Decree was the 28th of February 1933, the day after the fire, and it was the 1st of March 1933 that we see the very first concentration camp, which is basically for incarcerating people without trial, another power given to Hitler by the Reichstag Fire Decree. So there's quite a lot in that in a nutshell. Again, you would probably want to pause as we go through the next section. So there's Marinus van der Lubbe. There's a picture of the famous Reichstag Fire Decree. It's all in German, so it won't mean much to you, okay? But you can see the date, 28th of February 1933. Okay, and although there were, as you can see, several clauses, it was clause 1 and clause 2, the key ones, and they're the ones you need to know. and they're the ones that are highlighted there. I said 18, in my notes it says 25. I'm not actually sure on that one, to be perfectly honest. That's something you can check up in your own research. How many states were there in Germany in 1933? Okay. There's the point about the spirit of the decree was that it was only intended to be in the short term, but in fact it became a permanent feature. And by April, these special concentration camps, the first one was created on the 1st of March 1933, more than 25,000 political opponents, mainly communists and SPD, had been arrested without trial. And there's a picture of the most famous concentration camp, 22nd of March 1933, that was formed 2 days earlier on the 20th of March, just outside Munich, a place called Dachau. That was the model concentration camp, one of the most feared. Most of the concentration camps were just, certainly the early concentration camps, were disused factories. Many factories had closed down in the Great Depression, and simply the Nazis took them over, strung barbed wire around them, and put prisoners in them, and that became a concentration camp. But the most famous, Dachau, was a purposely built, it was originally a munitions factory, turned into a camp for political prisoners. Okay, so we've done 4 of the 5 strands. All we've got to do now is pull it to conclusion. What then happened? 5th of March 1933, we have the elections. So, in a nutshell, what was the outcome? So the Nazi election campaign undoubtedly had a huge impact. Okay, so 5th of March, the voters turned out in their millions, and the astonishing use of propaganda led by Goebbels, the political violence of the essay against the communists, which made it difficult for the communists to campaign, had all reaped benefit. And so the Nazi vote significantly went up. Why? The German middle classes in particular, terrified of the rising support for the Communist Party, utterly convinced by the Reichstag fire that it was a communist plot. The middle classes had seen, ever since the onset of the Great Depression, the Communist Party had been gathering more and more support. And so the middle classes on the whole were persuaded that a government led by Hitler and the Nazi Party was a necessary long-term solution, because they were the only group who could permanently remove the threat of a communist revolution. So, when they counted up the votes, the Nazi share of the vote astonishingly went up from 33%, which was 196 seats, to 44%, which was 230 seats. Now that was an astonishingly high figure. No other political party in the whole history of Germany, and Germany was formed in 1871, had ever achieved such a high proportion of the vote. But Hitler is still short of the 50% which he needs in order to be able to pass laws by himself. So in spite of everything he's done, he still has to be a coalition chancellor. So when Hitler was summoned by President Hindenburg to his office after the elections and had that conversation about, okay, I'm inviting you to form a government, a cabinet, Hitler knew that he would have to include within his cabinet some other political parties, because if he's going to get laws passed through the Reichstag, then he's going to have to persuade some members of the Reichstag to vote with the Nazis, and that means he's going to have to give some seats in his cabinet to other political parties. So in other words, it's going to tie his hands again. He can't be all powerful. But in spite of all that, Hitler had other plans. And that's because Hitler knew that we've talked about the famous Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution written by Hugo Preuss, but way down the list of articles of the Constitution was another Article 76, And this would provide a way out of this problem. But that is what we're going to look at in the next lesson, what Article 76 was and how Hitler would use it. So the detail that sits underneath it, it's all here. Okay, so again, just make sure you get the details, particularly the words in bold, into your notes. Okay, there is the election graph that shows this sort of astonishing figure. There's the Nazi vote. Okay, 44% reading across. But to get the 50%, he would have to bring in the DNVP into his cabinet, because the DNVP got 8%. 44 plus 8 equals 52%. So a coalition of the Nazis with the DNVP, with Hugenberg's DNVP, would be enough to be able to pass laws through the Reichstag. But Hitler doesn't want to be dependent upon the DNVP to be able to pass laws. That's the issue. Okay, you can see how difficult it was for the communists and for the SPD to campaign. Their vote had gone down. Okay, because of the difficulty of campaigning. So between them, those two parties got, SPD got 23%, 18%, and the KPD got 13%. 18 plus 13 was 31%. Previously in November, those two parties had achieved 30. So they've got 31% in March 33. Previously in November, those two parties between them had got 37%. So their vote has dropped by 6%. The Nazi vote has gone massively up. So there's the elections. Okay, and again, just looking at the detail there, we can now see, okay, the Germans had been to the polls. There had been 5 general elections in the previous 5 years. All the time, Reichstags were being dissolved and new elections. We can now see this was the last free election. There wouldn't be another free general election in Germany until 1949, okay, after World War II, with the formation of West Germany. But only 44%. Huge increase, but still 6% short. So he's going to need to maintain his coalition partnership with Hugenberg's DNVP. DNVP only got 8% of the vote, but it still puts a lot of power in Hugenberg's hands. Okay, and this final point, I won't talk about it here because that'll be the starting point for our next lesson, which will be about the Enabling Act, and that will be the first of a series of lessons about Gleichschaltung. So there's our finished picture, and as I say, our next topic, which will take about 3 lessons because there's a lot to do, is Gleichschaltung, and that will start off with the so-called Enabling Act of 24th of March 1933. Do some preparatory reading. The information in the textbook is pages 112 to 115, and as you do the reading in the textbook, think in particular about the Enabling Act, but secondly the creation of one-party state, how the working classes were brought under control, and how those separate states and more regional and local governments were all in the end centralised and brought under Hitler's national government in Berlin. So, topic of Gleichschaltung, which will take about 3 hours to sort of cover all of that. Thank you very much. You've got lots of background reading there. Remember, go to that. Remember, make sure you look at the Stephen J. Lee essay about the legal revolution. That's a really, really excellent essay, and there's a separate YouTube video in which I walk and talk you through that particular essay. William Carr, likewise, some good material in William Carr for you there. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was useful to you. Thank you.